Picture Rome not as a field of ruins filled with wandering tourists, but as it truly once was, enormous, alive, and pulsing with strength. It was the center of the ancient world, where emperors shaped the destiny of millions, where Roman legions marched across distant continents, and where all roads, in the most literal sense, led back to the eternal city. Now imagine that same Rome, broken, looted, humiliated, and left in smoke and silence. The fall of Rome was not the result of a single clash, nor of one terrible day. It was a long and corrosive process, an unraveling that stretched across centuries, built from bad choices, betrayals, and foreign pressures that Rome refused to face until it was too late. In this story, we will follow the decline step by step. We will discover who the so-called barbarians really were, and why they were only the final chapter of a tragedy that had been weakening for generations. For every ruin has a beginning, and Rome's collapse began at the very height of its power. At the start of the 1st century AD, Rome looked indestructible. Under emperors such as Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire expanded to its greatest reach. From the forests of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, from the Rhine to the valleys of Mesopotamia. It was a dominion of nearly 5 million square kilometers, home to more than 60 million people. 1 out of every 4 human beings alive lived under the wings of the Roman eagle. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought almost 2 centuries of stability. Roads stretched thousands of kilometers, linking cities and provinces. Aqueducts carried water into dry lands. Roman law, coinage, language, and architecture built a shared identity across a vast empire. The legions secured the borders, trade flourished, and the empire looked unstoppable. But behind the polished image, cracks had already begun to show. Rome had grown too vast. Each new province required more soldiers, more administrators, and more supplies. The economy relied on large estates worked by slaves. But when expansion slowed, the stream of new captives dwindled. The base that had supported Rome's productivity began to collapse. The empire had thrived on endless war and conquest, but when expansion stopped, the system turned upon itself. Taxes increased. Free citizens fell into poverty. The costs of government rose higher than the revenues it could collect. By the 2nd century, Rome was starving not for food, but for money. Trade routes that had once delivered riches from India, Africa, and deep Europe became unreliable. Piracy, constant wars, and unstable frontiers made transport costly and dangerous. Without steady tribute from far-off provinces and without fresh plunder, the empire slid into financial ruin. To keep its armies and public works alive, the government tampered with the currency. Less gold, less silver, more copper, and coins that carried less worth. Inflation soared. A sack of grain could double in price in only a few weeks. Confidence in the Roman economy withered, and the weight of taxation crushed small farmers, artisans, and peasants, many of whom could no longer hold on to their land. Others simply gave up their land. In search of protection, thousands went to powerful landlords, offering their labor and their crops in exchange for safety from tax collectors and roving bandits. This system, peasants tied to the estates of great lords, surrendering freedom for security, became the seed of what centuries later would grow into feudalism. It began here, during the breakdown of a state that could no longer provide justice, protection, or livelihood. The economic collapse did not only weaken Rome. It laid the foundation for a new order, one created out of despair. While the economy withered in silence, Roman politics erupted with chaos. From 235 AD, the empire entered what historians call military anarchy. In less than 50 years, more than 20 emperors claimed the throne. Most were murdered, deposed, or killed in battle. No rule lasted long. No throne was safe. Generals were raised to emperor by their own armies. Campaigns no longer focused on foreign enemies but turned inward. Roman legions fought Roman legions. Provinces clashed against provinces. Unity shattered. With the army consumed by civil wars, Rome's borders stood unguarded. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. The Sarmatians attacked Pannonia. Armed groups devastated entire provinces. Cities lost their defenses. Ordinary people feared not only invaders but their own soldiers, who plundered Roman towns as though they were enemy cities. The historian Zosimus wrote that Rome seemed to devour itself, and he did not exaggerate. Authority no longer commanded respect. The throne was no longer a symbol of order but a prize to seize. Power itself turned into spoils of war. To survive, Rome needed transformation, and in 285 AD it came. Emperor Diocletian made a drastic decision: to divide the empire. He established the Tetrarchy, 2 Augusti as senior rulers and 2 Caesars as junior rulers, each governing a region. For the first time, Rome was no longer one empire, but 2, east and west. Administratively, the plan made sense. Each half could handle its own crises, defend its own borders, and support its own armies. But the separation, though useful at first, created a fracture that would never truly heal. The East, centered on cities like Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, proved more stable. Its economy prospered, its trade routes were safer, its cities stronger, and its borders easier to defend. The West, however, faltered. With its capitals moving between Milan and Ravenna, the Western Empire endured repeated invasions, poor harvests, shrinking populations, and an army that was constantly short of funds. While the East grew stronger, the West steadily declined. Even the city of Rome, though still honored as a symbol, was no longer the true center of power. And it was here, in this weakened West, that the so-called barbarians would find their chance. To Roman writers, the word barbarian was a simple label. It grouped together everyone outside the Greco-Roman world, those who spoke unfamiliar languages, who ignored Roman law, and who lived beyond Roman customs. But this label was deceptive. The barbarians were not one savage horde. They were a mosaic of peoples, each with its own culture, faith, alliances, and ambitions. The Goths, split into Visigoths and Ostrogoths, were semi-nomadic Germanic tribes who had long served as allies in Rome's own armies. The Vandals marched through Gaul and Spain before establishing themselves in North Africa, where they built a fleet and a naval empire of their own. The Saxons and Franks pressed across the Rhine frontier. And most dreaded of all were the Huns, swift horsemen of the Central Asian steppes, unpredictable and fierce. Many of these groups did not seek to destroy Rome. They wanted to join it. They desired land, protection, and recognition. Some were welcomed as allies, granted official titles, given authority to rule Roman provinces, and even allowed to fight within the legions. But Roman arrogance poisoned these partnerships. Allies were met with suspicion, contempt, and treachery. Diplomacy was brittle. Trust was scarce. Such a fragile system could not endure forever. Contrary to later myths, the barbarian invasions were not mere raids. They were vast migrations, whole peoples on the move, tribes, clans, and families with their women and children, driven forward by forces Rome did not understand and could not control. The first great shock came with the arrival of the Huns. Ferocious and lightning-fast warriors from the steppes, their onslaught terrified the Germanic tribes along the Danube. The Visigoths, Vandals, and others fled in masses, seeking safety within Roman territory. But there were inner pressures as well. Lack of fertile farmland, together with swelling populations, pushed tribes to search for new lands. Even in decline, Rome still stood for stability, wealth, and opportunity. For many, entering the empire meant survival and hope. But Rome was no longer able to receive so many newcomers. Its borders were weak, its officials corrupt, its resources stretched too thin. Negotiations broke down through prejudice, deception, or simple chaos. What might have become peaceful settlement instead turned to conflict. One tribe pressed against another, and waves of migration swept across Europe. Some came in peace, others came for plunder. Rome, increasingly unstable, no longer had the strength to respond with confidence. For centuries, the empire had turned the barbarians to its own advantage. Entire tribes were granted the role of foederati, permitted to settle within Roman territory in exchange for military service. Germanic warriors, Alans, Vandals, and Goths all marched under Roman standards, guarding frontiers and fighting common foes. Some barbarian chiefs even held high Roman offices, ruled provinces, and joined Roman nobility through marriage. On the surface, it seemed like integration, but beneath that surface, anger grew. Despite their service, the so-called barbarians were never regarded as equals. Even while they filled the legions and protected the borders, they were watched with suspicion and treated with contempt. Promises of land and supplies were ignored. Corrupt governors demanded bribes. Food was denied. Some officials even subjected them to violence. That constant mistreatment turned allies into bitter enemies. In 378 AD, the tension erupted at the Battle of Adrianople. The Visigoths, abused and starving after seeking refuge inside the empire, rose in revolt. Emperor Valens marched to crush them, trusting in Roman superiority. But arrogance could not save him. His army was caught unready, and the disaster was overwhelming. Valens was killed, and nearly two-thirds of his troops were destroyed. This was more than defeat. It was a symbol. For the first time in centuries, Rome had been humbled. The barbarians were no longer background actors. They had become central figures in the empire's story, and Rome itself was no longer untouchable. And just as the Visigoths carved their place into history, a new terror emerged on the horizon. A name that would haunt Rome forever: Attila. The Huns had already been a menace, but in 434 AD Attila rose to power. He welded scattered nomadic groups into a disciplined war machine. He was not only a warlord, but also a strategist, a negotiator, and a merciless ruler. He bargained with Rome when it suited him, and when it did not, he reduced cities to ashes. Under Attila's rule, the Huns swept through the Balkans, menaced Constantinople, and demanded enormous tributes. They devastated lands from the Danube to the Black Sea, then turned west, spreading destruction across Gaul. Roman writers struggled to capture his impact. They called him the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, not out of faith, but because his devastation seemed beyond human measure. In 451 AD, Attila launched his boldest strike, the invasion of Gaul. City after city collapsed. Fear raced faster than fire. The Western Empire tottered on the edge of ruin. Yet against all odds, a fragile alliance formed. The Roman general Flavius Aetius, remembered as the last great commander of Rome, rallied what strength was left. He united imperial troops with the Visigoths under their king Theodoric, along with other federated peoples. It was a desperate coalition, the final line of defense. The decisive clash came on the Catalonian plains, one of the bloodiest battles of late antiquity. The struggle was savage. Theodoric was slain, but Attila was driven back. Rome survived barely, but relief was short. The next year, Attila returned, this time aiming straight at Italy. Cities such as Aquileia were obliterated. Panic swept the peninsula. Even Rome itself seemed about to fall. Then came a moment cloaked in mystery. Pope Leo I rode out to confront Attila in person. What truly passed between them remains unknown. Whether it was a miracle, a bribe, political promises, or dark threats of plague and famine. But the impossible occurred. Attila turned away. Rome was spared. Only 2 years later, Attila was dead, and the empire he forged shattered into fragments. Yet the wounds he left upon Rome's spirit ran deep. The city survived in stone, but in soul it was already broken. Even before Attila's terror, Rome had endured a shock that seemed unthinkable. In 410 AD, the Eternal City, untouched by foreign invaders for nearly 800 years, fell at last. And not to distant strangers, but to one of Rome's former allies, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. For years Alaric had fought faithfully for Rome. He had commanded as a Roman general, sought fair treaties, and demanded payments long promised but never delivered. Time and again he was ignored, dismissed, and betrayed. At last his patience was gone. Alaric marched directly on Rome. Though no longer the political capital, the city remained the beating heart, the symbol of empire. When its gates opened, resistance was feeble. For 3 days the Visigoths plundered without restraint. Temples, palaces, storehouses, monuments, none were spared. It was not mass slaughter. It was not complete destruction. But the psychological blow was devastating. To those who lived through it, this was more than a sack. It felt like the end of the world. The scholar Jerome wrote in anguish, capturing the despair in one sentence: "The world has collapsed." Alaric did not erase Rome's stones, but he shattered its illusion. And that illusion, the myth of eternal invincibility, was what bound the empire together. From that moment, the mask was gone. If the Visigoths had shown Rome could fall, the Vandals proved it could fall again. In 455 AD, only 45 years after Alaric's sack, the city once more lay exposed. Its emperor had been assassinated. The government was paralyzed. The army barely existed. Genseric, king of the Vandals, crossed the Mediterranean with a vast fleet. He landed in Italy and marched without resistance toward Rome. This time there was no defense at all. For 14 days the Vandals looted the city. Unlike the swift plundering of the Visigoths, the Vandals moved carefully and with precision. They knew exactly what they wanted: gold, silver, jewels, sacred relics, even treasures once taken from the Temple of Jerusalem by Emperor Titus centuries earlier were carried away. Genseric did not stop with wealth. He seized valuable hostages, among them the widowed Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters. Once more, the city was spared complete destruction, but it was left stripped, emptied of pride, hollowed out of its dignity. The cultural wound cut so deep that long afterward, the very word Vandal came to mean brutal, senseless ruin. Even though Genseric's sack had been deliberate and strategic, memory twisted it into the symbol of devastation. By that time, Rome was no longer the empire's official capital. Power had shifted to Ravenna, yet Rome remained the soul of the empire, and that soul was now left bare. 2 decades later, in 475 AD, a child was placed on the throne. His name carried a cruel irony: Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, echoing the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus, echoing its first emperor. But this Romulus would not build, he would end. Raised to the throne by his father, Orestes, a general of Roman Germanic descent, Romulus was only a figurehead. He presided over a dying empire that had already lost control of much of its land. Its armies were hollow shells of their former legions. Its authority was thin, fragile, almost meaningless. In 476 AD, Odoacer, a barbarian commander in Roman service, demanded land in Italy for his men. When Orestes refused, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, defeated the imperial forces, and deposed the boy emperor. There was no grand battle, no glorious last defense. Romulus was spared, granted a small pension, and disappeared from history's stage. What mattered was not his fate, but what followed. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer required an emperor. The throne was left vacant, and it would never be filled again. The Western Roman Empire ended, not in triumph, but in silence. Dismantled from within, corroded by arrogance, weakened by centuries of decay. The fall of Rome was not only an ending, it was also a beginning. The collapse of the West in 476 AD did not erase Rome's legacy. Its law, its language, its architecture, and even its faith endured. They were absorbed, reshaped, and carried forward by new rulers, new kingdoms, and new civilizations that rose on its ruins. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, would survive nearly 1,000 years more. But in the West, only fragments remained. Cathedrals razed with stones from pagan temples, Germanic kings taking Roman titles, monks guarding ancient manuscripts. A medieval world emerged, rural, fractured, unstable. Yet in its very foundations, Rome still lived, in every legal code, in every Romance language born of Latin, in every vision of imperial rule. Rome had fallen, but it continued to whisper. The story was not a single catastrophe. It was not the tale of one invasion, one battlefield, or one emperor's downfall. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow unraveling stretched across centuries. Economy, politics, and society all decayed together. The empire had lived on conquest. But when conquest ceased, the lifeblood, the wealth, ran dry. The currency collapsed. Inflation spiraled out of control. People lost trust first in their rulers, and then in the entire system itself. Power drifted away, from emperors to generals, from generals to warlords, and finally from warlords to kings. By the time Romulus Augustulus faded into obscurity, there was no great battle, no thunderous last defense. The ending came quietly. The mightiest empire of the West dissolved not with a roar, but with a sigh. Yet Rome never truly perished. This dominion was gone, but its essence remained. Roman law became the backbone of new systems of justice. The Latin tongue transformed into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, the Romance languages that endure today. Roman architecture, engineering, and city planning continued to shape cathedrals, castles, palaces, and aqueducts for centuries. Even Rome's faith, Christianity, once persecuted within its own borders, spread across Europe and reshaped entire cultures. And perhaps most striking of all, the dream of Rome never faded. Medieval rulers styled themselves as Caesars. The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire claimed to be Rome reborn. Even Napoleon and Mussolini, centuries later, summoned Rome's ghost to drive their ambitions. Rome's body had collapsed, but its spirit endured. Why does the fall of Rome still haunt us? Because Rome was more than stone and streets. It was an idea, the belief that humanity could forge something eternal, a civilization too strong to fail. And yet it fell. Rome reminds us that empires rarely vanish in a single day. They corrode slowly from within. They dismiss the warnings. They grow arrogant, sure of their invulnerability, until the foundations rot and the walls finally crumble. Yet Rome also offers a lesson in resilience. Out of its ruins arose new worlds, unstable, yes, but full of life. Rome whispered through the Middle Ages, reappeared in the Renaissance, and still echoes today in our languages, our laws, and our vision of power. Every ending carries within it a beginning. Picture it once again. Rome in its brilliance, roads stretching beyond sight, legions moving in flawless formation, aqueducts bringing water into vibrant cities, emperors lifting their hands as if to command the known world. And then picture that same Rome, abandoned, hushed, its treasures plundered, its young emperor dethroned, its seat of power left vacant. The eternal city lived on, but the eternal empire did not. This was the fall of Rome.